At exactly 2 a.m., frantic pounding shook my front door. The moment I opened it, my daughter collapsed into my arms, wearing the same wedding dress she had left in only hours before. It was torn, soaked with mud, and her face and arms were covered with dark bruises. Through trembling sobs, she whispered, "Dad, he hit me 45 times." I reached for my phone to call the police, but she grabbed my wrist and pleaded, "Please don't, not yet. If you call them now, you'll never learn what really happened on my wedding night." Before sunrise, I uncovered a secret far more terrifying than I had ever imagined. Thank you for being here. It means more than you know. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from your city? Your country? I read every single one. Here on Revenge. Dad, every story carries a lesson worth staying for. Note: some elements have been dramatized for storytelling depth. Any similarity to specific names or locations is entirely coincidental. The last thing I remembered before the knocking was the way Lily had smiled at me across the reception hall. She was standing beside Derek near the champagne tower, her white gown catching the warm light of the chandeliers, laughing at something one of his cousins had said. It was the kind of laugh that came from her stomach, the same laugh she'd had since she was 4 years old, loud and completely unself-conscious. I had driven home at 12:20 in the morning, telling myself I was worrying over nothing. Telling myself I had raised a strong woman who knew her own mind. I was 65 years old. I had spent 30 years catching people who lied for a living. I should have known better than to believe my own reassurances. The knocking started at 2 in the morning. It wasn't the sound of someone at a door. It was the sound of someone using the last strength they had left to reach one. 3 slow, uneven impacts against the wood, like a fist that had forgotten how to make a fist. I was out of bed before the third knock landed, my heart already slamming against my sternum, the way it used to, before I walked into a room where I knew something had gone badly wrong. I crossed the hallway in the dark and pulled open the front door. The porch light fell over my daughter like a spotlight over a crime scene. Lily stood on the welcome mat in her wedding gown, or what was left of it. The silk was torn from the left shoulder down to the hip, streaked with dirt, and something darker I didn't want to name yet. Her feet were bare, and the concrete had opened 3 long cuts across her right heel that were still bleeding onto the mat. Her hair had come completely loose from whatever elaborate arrangement had taken 2 hours that morning, hanging in tangled ropes around a face I almost didn't recognize, not because it was swollen, though it was, but because every expression I had ever seen on my daughter had been replaced by something hollow and locked down and very, very far away. "Lock the door," she whispered. Her voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Lock it and don't let them bring me back." My chest cracked open like dry wood. I reached for her arm and pulled her inside, and the moment her body crossed the threshold, she grabbed the front of my shirt with both hands and pressed her forehead against my collarbone and started shaking so hard I could hear her teeth knock together. I wrapped both arms around her and held on, and I looked over the top of her head at the empty street outside the parked cars, the neighbors' dark windows, the ordinary California night that had apparently been going on, completely unaware of whatever had just happened to my child. I kicked the door shut, threw the deadbolt, then the chain. "Lily." I kept my voice low, and even the voice I used 30 years ago when I was talking someone down from a ledge of a different kind. "I need you to stay right here for 30 seconds. Can you do that?" She lifted her face. Her lower lip was split, and her left cheekbone was darkening into a bruise the size of my palm. But it was her eyes that stopped me. Not tears, not panic, but a flat, exhausted calculation like she had already done all the math on tonight and arrived at the only answer that made sense. "There were 45, Dad," she said. "I counted every single one. My legs wanted to stop working. I didn't let them. I grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter and called Frank Delgado before I called anyone else. Frank had spent 22 years as a homicide detective with the LAPD before his knees gave out and forced him into retirement, and in 30 years of working adjacent cases, I had never met anyone who understood evidence preservation the way Frank did. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he wasn't sleeping either. "Ray?" His voice was sandpaper and coffee. "What happened?" "My daughter just came home from her wedding reception," I said. "She's injured. I need you to tell me exactly what to do in the next 10 minutes before I call 911. There was a single beat of silence. Then Frank shifted into the precise, unrushed cadence he used when the situation required thinking faster than it required talking. "Don't let her change clothes," he said. Don't let her shower or wash her hands. Get your phone and photograph everything: her dress, her feet, her face, her arms, every visible injury before anything is touched or cleaned. Do you have a clean paper bag? Not plastic. Paper. Kitchen? Yes. Put the dress in it after the paramedics clear her. Paper breathes, it won't degrade biological evidence the way plastic will. And Ray. He paused. Write down the exact time you opened that door. 2:03, I said, looking at the clock above the stove. Good. Now, call 911. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I spent the next 8 minutes doing exactly what Frank told me to do. I photographed Lily's dress from 4 angles while she stood in the entryway and let me her arms wrapped around her own ribs like she was trying to hold herself together from the outside. I photographed her feet, her wrists, where dark band-shaped bruising was already rising to the surface of her skin and the left side of her face. She didn't flinch away from the camera. She stood with her chin slightly raised and her jaw set, and that more than anything else told me how much it had cost her to get through tonight, because my daughter had always hated having her picture taken. You're doing great, I told her, and my voice only broke a little bit at the end. I got out, she said. Her eyes filled, but she blinked it back hard, refusing to let it spill. I just kept thinking I just have to get out and get to you. That's the only thing I thought about. My throat closed completely. I turned away to get the paper bag from under the kitchen sink because I needed 5 seconds to press the heel of my hand against my mouth and breathe. Then I called 911. While we waited for the ambulance, I sat on the couch beside Lily, with her cold hand between both of mine, and I looked at the door I had just bolted shut, and I thought about the 30 years I had spent finding people who thought they had gotten away with something. I thought about how they always believed the evidence was gone. They were almost always wrong. Whoever did this, I thought, is already building their story. I need to build mine faster. The paramedics moved through my living room, like they owned it, and I let them. There were 2 of them, a young woman with red hair pulled back tight, and an older man whose hands never once stopped moving as he worked. They had Lily on the gurney in under 4 minutes, an oxygen sensor clipped to her finger, a blood pressure cuff inflating on her arm, a flashlight checking her pupils. I stood in the corner of my own entryway, holding the paper bag with her wedding dress inside, and watched them work, and I felt something cold and very precise settle into the center of my chest. Not grief, not panic. Focus. Frank Delgado arrived at the same moment the ambulance was pulling away from the curb. He jogged up the driveway in a gray sweatshirt and old running shoes, his white hair flattened on one side from the pillow, and he took one look at my face and said, "How about 45?" I said. Frank closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them and held out his hand for the paper bag. He turned it over carefully in both hands, checking the seal, checking the fold at the top, then handed it back. "Good," he said. "You did it right. I'll follow you to the hospital." Huntington Hospital received us the way emergency rooms receive everyone at 2:30 in the morning, with fluorescent lights and the smell of industrial cleaner and a triage nurse who had clearly seen too much to be shocked by anything. They took Lily back immediately. Frank and I sat in the waiting area for 40 minutes before a doctor came out to speak with me. Her name was Dr. Renee Castillo, and she had the careful, measured delivery of someone who had learned to give hard information without flinching. She sat across from me with a clipboard on her knee and told me that Lily had sustained 45 documented injuries, contusions, and soft tissue damage concentrated across her upper back, shoulders, arms, hips, and thighs. Positions. Dr. Castillo said that were consistent with deliberate targeting of areas that would be concealed by clothing. Her right wrist shows ligature-style bruising. Dr. Castillo continued, consistent with forceful restraint. There are also compression marks on both forearms, suggesting she was held down against a flat surface for an extended period. I pressed my back teeth together until my jaw ached. "Is she going to be okay?" I asked. "She's going to need time," Dr. Castillo said carefully. "But yes, she's stable." I nodded. I trusted myself to nod. I did not trust myself to speak for another few seconds. When they let me into Lily's room, Frank waited outside. She was propped up slightly against the pillows, an ice pack wrapped in a towel pressed against her left cheekbone, an IV line taped to the inside of her elbow. The hospital gown made her look younger than 28. She looked up when I walked in, and her face did something complicated: relief and exhaustion, and a grief so raw it made my own eyes burn. "Hey, Dad," she said, and her voice cracked straight down the middle. Hey, sweetheart. I pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down and took her hand in both of mine, and I felt her fingers curl around mine and squeeze hard enough to hurt, and I was grateful for it. Detective Sarah Mitchell arrived 20 minutes later. She was a compact woman in her early 40s with sharp, attentive eyes and the kind of posture that suggested she had learned early in her career that how you walked into a room told people everything about whether they could trust you. She introduced herself quietly, showed her badge, and asked if Lily was willing to give a statement. Lily looked at me. I gave her hand one squeeze and let go. "Yes," Lily said. "I'm willing." She told it the way she had probably rehearsed it a dozen times on the taxi ride over steady and sequential, one detail after another, no editorializing. The room at the Ashford Grand. Carolyn waiting inside with the lawyer and the guard, the documents on the table. Derek locking the door, the moment she understood that this was not a misunderstanding. "He held my wrists," Lily said, and her voice dropped but didn't break. "He held them against the headboard and he told me to stop fighting. He said." She stopped, pressed her lips together. Her free hand gripped the edge of the hospital blanket so hard her knuckles went pale. "He said the sooner I signed, the sooner it would be over," Detective Mitchell wrote without looking up from her notepad. "And you refused to sign." "Every single time," Lily said, and for just a moment, something fierce and burning moved across her face like a weather front. "Every single time." Mitchell clicked her pen once and looked up. "Ms. Cole, I need to share some information with you, and I want you to hear it before I explain what it means." She paused just long enough to make sure she had both our attention. "The Ashford family contacted law enforcement at approximately 1:15 this morning, roughly 40 minutes before your father called 911. They reported that you had consumed an excessive amount of alcohol at the reception, become combative, taken a set of wedding jewelry valued at $180,000, and fled the hotel without cause." The blood drained out of Lily's face so fast I reached for her arm. "They told the police I stole from them," she said. Her voice had gone very flat and very quiet, the way a voice gets when the brain is working too fast for the mouth to keep up. "Before I even got here, She stopped. Her chin started to tremble, and she pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth and took 3 hard breaths through her nose. "They knew I was going to get away. They planned for it. They already had a story." "Oh, that's what it looks like," Mitchell said. There was something careful and honest in her voice that I appreciated. She wasn't sugarcoating it, but she wasn't delivering it like a blow either. 20 minutes later, Derek Ashford appeared in the hallway outside Lily's room. He was still in his wedding tuxedo. His bow tie was loosened, and his eyes were red-rimmed, and he was crying with the practiced sincerity of a man who had rehearsed it. A lawyer in a dark suit stood at his shoulder. Derek spread both hands in a gesture of helpless anguish and said loudly enough for the nurses at the station to hear, "I just want to know that my wife is safe. Please, I just need to see her." I stepped out into the hallway and closed the door behind me. Derek's eyes found mine, and something shifted behind the grief just for a fraction of a second. A quick recalculation like a man adjusting his footing. Then the tears came back and he took a step toward me with his hand outstretched. "Raymond," he said, "please, whatever she told you." "She came home to me with 45 injuries," I said. I kept my voice level and my hands loose at my sides. "Before you say one more word, I need you to understand that I counted every single one of them, and I have been doing this kind of work for 30 years. I looked at him for a long moment. "Go home, Derek." His hand dropped. The lawyer put a firm hand on his elbow and murmured something close to his ear, and Derek let himself be steered back toward the elevator, his shoulders shaking with sobs that cut off the moment the elevator doors closed between us. I went back into Lily's room. She was watching the door, her eyes bright and hard and waiting. "Was that him?" "Yes." "What did he say?" "Nothing that mattered." I sat back down and reached into my jacket pocket and took out my wallet. Opened the small inner fold I hadn't opened in over 20 years. Inside, behind an old dry cleaning receipt, was a business card, plain white. A single phone number in black ink, no name. I had been carrying it so long, the edges had gone soft. Lily watched me stare at it. "Dad," she said quietly. "What is that?" "Something I should have dealt with a long time ago," I said. The hospital hallway at 3:47 in the morning had the particular silence of a place that never fully sleeps. The distant beep of monitors, the soft compression of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, the hum of a vending machine at the far end of the corridor, offering bad coffee at $2 a cup. I sat in a plastic chair outside Lily's room with the business card balanced on my knee and stared at it until the numbers started to blur. 22 years. That was how long I had been carrying this card, long enough that the ink had faded slightly at the center where my thumb had pressed against it over and over in moments exactly like this one. Moments when I almost called and then talked myself back from the edge. I had 1,000 reasons not to call. Every single one of them felt very small at 3:47 in the morning, with my daughter sleeping behind a hospital door. I pressed call. It rang twice. Raymond. The voice that came through the line was low and clear and completely awake, as if she had been sitting beside her own phone, waiting for it to ring. There was no surprise in it, only a weight like a held breath finally released. You wouldn't call me unless it was about her. My throat tightened so fast it hurt. It is, I said. She needs her mother. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. I counted them. I'll be there, Margaret Ellison said. Don't let anyone into that room until I arrive. She hung up before I could respond. I sat with the dead phone against my ear for a moment, longer than I needed to, then lowered it to my lap. My hand was trembling just slightly, just enough that I noticed it, and I pressed it flat against my thigh until it stopped. 30 years of keeping steady in rooms where things had gone wrong, and it was a 40-second phone call that finally got to me. 42 minutes later, a black sedan pulled up to the emergency entrance. I was standing at the glass doors when it arrived. Margaret Ellison stepped out first, and the thing that struck me, the thing that always struck me when I saw her after long stretches of absence, was how completely she occupied whatever space she walked into. She was 62 years old, dressed in dark slacks and a charcoal blazer over a simple shirt, her silver-streaked hair pulled back without fuss. No jewelry, except a watch. Nothing about her appearance announced wealth or authority. Everything about the way she moved did. Behind her came Sandra Okafor, Margaret's chief legal counsel, a tall woman in her mid-40s with a leather portfolio under one arm and the focused expression of someone who had already been working for an hour before she left the house. Sandra was scanning the building as she walked, her eyes moving in the quick, professional pattern of someone cataloging exits and sight lines. Margaret crossed the distance between the car and the entrance without looking left or right, and when she reached me, she stopped and met my eyes, and neither of us said anything for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then she said, "How bad is it, Raymond?" 45 injuries, I said. Documented, concentrated on her back arms and hips, places her dress would cover. Something moved across Margaret's face. Not tears. Margaret Ellison did not cry in parking lots, but a tightening around the eyes and jaw that I recognized as the same expression she had worn 22 years ago, when she had signed the papers that sent Lily to live with me and told herself it was the right thing to do. "Does she know who I am?" Margaret asked. "No, you never told her." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't an accusation. It was just a statement of a fact we both already knew. "She stopped asking when she was 12, I said. I kept waiting for the right moment. I looked at the automatic doors. There was never a right moment. "No," Margaret said, and her voice dropped half a register. "There wasn't. I know that better than anyone." Sandra stepped forward before the conversation could go anywhere neither of us was ready to go. "I need to know if the hotel has been contacted by law enforcement yet," she said to me directly, her voice crisp and businesslike, "and whether any preservation requests have gone out for their surveillance systems." "Not yet," I said. Detective Mitchell took Lily's statement. "I don't know where the investigation stands as of right now." Sandra was already opening her portfolio. "Then we move first," she said. "What's the name of the hotel?" "The Ashford Grand, downtown Los Angeles." She wrote it down without looking up. "Who manages their building systems?" "Do you know?" "No. But Frank Delgado is inside. He's a retired LAPD homicide detective. He can tell you who to contact." Sandra nodded, once clicked her pen, and walked through the automatic doors with the forward momentum of someone who had never in her life waited to be invited into a room. Margaret watched her go. Then she turned back to me and said, "Take me to Lily." I brought her in through the side corridor and introduced her to the night nurse as an old family friend who was also providing legal support, which was accurate in every factual sense and wrong in every other sense imaginable. The nurse checked Margaret's ID and waved us through. Lily was awake. She was sitting up slightly against her pillows, the ice pack still pressed to her cheek, staring at the ceiling, with the expression of someone whose mind was moving faster than she wanted it to. She looked over when we came in, and her eyes moved from me to Margaret and back again with the quick perceptive assessment she had inherited from Well. "This is Margaret Ellison," I said. "She's an old friend. She's also going to make sure you have the legal support you need." Lily studied Margaret for a moment, with eyes that were red-rimmed but sharp. "Okay," she said finally. Her voice was hoarse and scraped raw. "Thank you for coming." Margaret stepped to the side of the bed. She stood close enough to reach out and touch Lily's hand, but did not reach out. Her jaw was tight, and her eyes were doing something complicated that she was working very hard to control. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful and even. "Can you tell me what happened?" she said. "In your own words, at whatever pace you need." Lily looked at her for one more moment, taking in something about Margaret's face that she couldn't quite name, yet some quality of attention that went beyond professional concern. And then she started talking. I stood in the doorway and watched my daughter tell her story to her mother for the first time, and I pressed the back of my knuckles against my mouth and breathed through my nose and told myself I was going to hold it together. I almost managed it. At 5:12 in the morning, Sandra appeared at my elbow with her phone in her hand, showing me a sent confirmation. "Litigation hold letter delivered to the Ashford Grand's legal department and registered agent," she said quietly. "It requires them to preserve all surveillance footage, keycard access logs, server records, staff schedules, and room service entries from the past 72 hours. Under California law, any destruction of that material after receipt of this notice constitutes spoliation of evidence, which carries its own legal consequences separate from the underlying charges." "What does that mean in plain language?" I asked. "It means," Sandra said, "that if they try to delete anything now, they've just handed us another crime to prosecute them with." I looked through the small window in the door at Lily and Margaret, my daughter talking, her hands moving, and Margaret leaning slightly forward in her chair, with an expression on her face that looked from this angle very much like a woman trying not to shatter. By the time the sun rose over Pasadena, the Ashford family's window to erase the evidence was already closed. They just didn't know it yet. I left the hospital at 7:15 in the morning. Lily had finally fallen into a proper sleep around 6, the kind that comes after the body has simply run out of ways to stay awake. Margaret was sitting in the chair beside her bed, with a cup of cold coffee balanced on her knee, and her eyes fixed on Lily's face with an expression I had no business witnessing, so I looked away and told Margaret I would be back by noon. She nodded without looking up. Sandra was already in the corridor on her phone, 3 steps ahead of whatever was coming next. Frank was waiting for me in the hospital parking lot, leaning against the hood of his truck with his arms crossed and a paper cup of actual decent coffee from the diner across the street extended in my direction. I took it with both hands. "Talk to me," he said. "The family reported her for theft before she even got here," I said. "They had a video of her walking unsteady in the lobby. They called it alcohol impairment." Frank's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened in the way they did when a detail landed wrong. "Timestamp on the video." Mitchell didn't say. "That's the first thing we need." He pushed off the hood of the truck. "And we need to find whoever brought her to you. You said she came by taxi." She told me, "No phone, no wallet, no money. Driver still took her." Frank nodded slowly, already thinking 3 moves ahead. "Cab companies GPS log every fare. If we can pull traffic camera footage from the area around the Ashford Grand between 1 and 2 in the morning, we find the cab. We find the cab. We find the driver. We find the driver. We find someone who saw her before any of this became a story." "I finished." Frank pointed at me. "Now you're thinking like a cop again." We drove separately to the block around the Ashford Grand in downtown Los Angeles. The hotel occupied the corner of a wide intersection, all glass and brushed steel, and a canopy that probably cost more than my first house. At 8 in the morning, the city was already moving delivery trucks, double parked on the side street. A coffee cart doing brisk business on the corner, pigeons conducting their own investigations on the sidewalk. I sat in my car and pulled up the intersection on my phone, while Frank made 2 calls to people whose names he didn't share with me. That was fine. Frank had spent 22 years building a network of people who owed him favors or trusted his judgment, and I had long since learned not to ask questions about the machinery that kept that network running. 14 minutes later, he knocked on my passenger window and got in. "Traffic Management Division," he said. "I've got a contact there who pulled the relevant camera angles for the time window we need. 1:05 to 1:30 in the morning." He turned his phone toward me. The footage was grainy and shot from above. The way traffic cameras always are, a God's eye view of an intersection that makes everyone look small and purposeful and unaware they're being watched. We watched it together in fast forward until Frank tapped the screen at 1:14. A taxi pulled to the curb at the service entrance on the side street behind the hotel. It idled. At 1:17, a figure in white came through the service door at a run. Even from above, even in the grainy gray of a traffic camera at night, I knew my daughter's gait. I had watched her run since she was 2 years old. She crossed the sidewalk in 6 steps and pulled open the back door of the taxi and got in, and the taxi pulled away from the curb 40 seconds later. My chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with my heart and everything to do with what I was looking at: my daughter in a ruined wedding dress running through a service exit at 1:17 in the morning, and somewhere up in that building, Derek Ashford was already on the phone with a lawyer constructing the story that would explain it away. "Cab company?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Already running the plate," Frank said. "Give me an hour." The hour became 40 minutes. The driver's name was Marcus Webb, and he had been working the overnight shift for the same cab company for 15 years. Frank reached him by phone, and Marcus picked up on the third ring with the cautious wariness of a man who gets a lot of calls from numbers he doesn't recognize. Frank explained who we were and what we were looking for. There was a pause on the line. Then Marcus Webb said, "I was wondering when somebody was going to call me." We met him at a diner in Silver Lake 40 minutes later. Marcus was a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of hands that looked like they had spent decades wrapped around a steering wheel. He was already in a booth with a plate of eggs when we arrived, and he stood up to shake both our hands with a grip that was firm and direct. "I couldn't stop thinking about it," he said before either of us had sat down. He pressed both palms flat on the table and leaned forward, and his voice dropped with an urgency that told me he had been carrying this since it happened. "I've been driving nights for 15 years. I've seen a lot of things come out of a lot of hotels. But that girl..." He stopped, shook his head, hard jaw working. "She came out of that service exit running like she thought someone was right behind her. No shoes, no bag, dress half torn off her shoulder. And she climbs in my cab, and the first thing she says is..." He pulled out his phone and set it on the table between us. "I want you to hear it for yourself." He pressed play on the dash cam audio file. The recording was time-stamped 1:17 in the morning. There was the sound of a car door opening, then the soft impact of someone collapsing into a back seat, breathing hard and ragged. Then Lily's voice, thin and shaking, but absolutely clear. "They want to take my property. Please just drive. They were going to keep going until I signed, and I wouldn't sign, so please drive." Marcus's voice low and steady. "I've got you. You're safe. Where do we go?" Lily's voice, and I heard it crack open on the last word, like something that had been held together past its limit. "My dad's house. Please." My hand came down on the table harder than I intended. Frank put his hand briefly on my forearm, just for a second, just enough, and I breathed through my nose until my vision cleared. Marcus stopped the recording. He was watching me with the careful attention of a man who understood exactly what he had just played. "She didn't have any money," he said. "She told me in the cab. No phone, no wallet, nothing. I told her it didn't matter." He straightened up and looked me directly in the eye. "I've got 2 daughters, Mr. Cole. I told her to keep her money even if she'd had any. I just drove. I had to look away for a moment. I looked at the window at the Silver Lake street outside going about its ordinary morning business, and I pressed my back teeth together and gave myself 5 seconds. "Mr. Webb," I said when I had them, "that recording, would you be willing to turn it over to law enforcement?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "I've been waiting for someone to ask," he said. "I kept the file because I knew it mattered. I just didn't know who to call." He picked up his coffee cup and wrapped both hands around it and looked at me over the rim. "You find out who did that to her. We're building that case right now," I said. Marcus nodded slowly. Then he said, "My cousin's wife works housekeeping at the Ashford Grand, late shift. She called me the morning after it happened, said she couldn't sleep, said she'd heard something that night she didn't know what to do with." He set the cup down. "I told her to wait, told her someone would come asking eventually." He looked at me steadily. "I think that someone is you." I felt the first solid piece of something click into place, the particular sensation I remembered from 30 years of work when the shape of a case begins to reveal itself from the inside out. The story the Ashfords had told the police was already developing cracks, I thought. I just needed to find the right person to widen them. Marcus Webb's cousin's wife was named Rosa Navarro, and she lived in a second-floor apartment in East Los Angeles, with a window box of marigolds on the sill and a security door that she did not open right away when I knocked. I heard her on the other side of it, the small sounds of someone checking the peephole weighing a decision. "Mrs. Navarro," I said, keeping my voice low and unhurried. "My name is Raymond Cole. Marcus Webb gave me your address. I'm not here to cause you any trouble. I just need 5 minutes." A pause. Then the deadbolt turned. Rosa Navarro was a compact woman in her late 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a braid and the careful, watchful eyes of someone who had learned early that the world did not reliably reward people who spoke up. She was still in her housecoat, a mug of coffee cradled in both hands, and she looked at me the way people look at something they're not sure whether to be relieved or frightened by. "Marcus said you might come," she said. She did not invite me in right away. "He said you were trying to help the girl from the hotel." "She's my daughter," I said. Rosa's expression shifted. Something cracked open in it, just slightly the way a door cracks open before someone decides whether to swing it wide. She looked at me for another long moment, then stepped back from the threshold. "Come in," she said, "but I need you to understand something first." Her apartment was small and meticulously kept the kind of order that comes from taking pride in a space regardless of its size. She sat across from me at a kitchen table with a saint's candle burning on the windowsill and her coffee mug wrapped in both hands like a lifeline, and she told me what she was afraid of before she told me anything else. "I have worked at that hotel for 11 years, she said. Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were pale against the mug. "I have a daughter in her second year of community college. I have a mother I send money to every month. If I lose that job—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "You understand what I'm saying?" "I do," I said. "And I'm not going to pretend that what I'm asking you to do doesn't carry risk. I won't lie to you about that." I leaned forward slightly, keeping my hands open on the table. "But Mrs. Navarro, my daughter came home to me that night with 45 injuries. 45. And the people who did it called the police before she even made it to the hospital and told them she was a drunk who stole jewelry." My voice stayed even, but I felt it cost me something to keep it that way. "They already have a story. I just need the truth to be louder." Rosa stared at her coffee. Her jaw was working like she was trying to chew through something difficult. Then she looked up, and her eyes were bright with the particular brightness that comes right before tears that a person refuses to shed. "I'm not going to tell you today," she said. "I need to think about it." She met my gaze directly. "But I want you to know that I haven't slept more than 3 hours since that night. Not because I'm scared, though I am scared, but because I keep hearing it." Her voice dropped. "The counting. I keep hearing the counting." I took a business card from my jacket pocket and set it on the table in front of her. I did not push it toward her. I just left it there. "My daughter doesn't need you to be a hero, Mrs. Navarro," I said. "She just needs you to say what you saw, in your own words at your own pace to the right people." I stood up. "Whenever you're ready, no pressure, no deadline." She looked at the card, but didn't pick it up. I thanked her for her time and let myself out. Tommy Reeves worked the afternoon setup shift at a sports bar in Koreatown, and I found him restocking the beer fridge behind the counter when I walked in at 2 in the afternoon. He was young, 28, maybe 29, with the easy, sociable manner of someone who had spent years learning to read a room and keep everyone in it comfortable. He straightened up when I introduced myself, and I watched his expression do something interesting. Not guilt, not evasion, but a kind of relief, like a man who had been waiting for someone to ask him a specific question. "The Cole wedding," he said, before I had finished explaining why I was there. "I've been thinking about that night since it happened." "Tell me," I said. Tommy leaned both forearms on the bar and spoke in the direct, unembellished way of someone reporting exactly what they observed. He said Derek Ashford had not touched a drop of alcohol the entire reception. Not one drink. Tommy had noticed because it was unusual. Grooms almost always had at least 2 or 3, and Derek had held the same glass of sparkling water for 4 hours while playing the role of the happy, charming newlywed. About 20 minutes before they went upstairs, Tommy said, "Mr. Ashford came to the bar. He asked me for a glass of Cabernet." He paused. But he didn't drink it. He carried it back across the room and Tommy stopped and shook his head, jaw tightening with something that looked a lot like disgust. He walked up behind her while she was talking to a guest, and he just tipped it, like he'd bumped into her by accident. Poured it right down the back of her dress. My hands gripped the edge of the bar stool, and I made myself ease off before I bent it. "And then?" I asked. "And then he laughed," Tommy said. His voice had gone flat and hard. He made this big show of apologizing to her, touching her shoulder, dabbing at the dress with a napkin. And then he said to the people standing around them loud enough for I'd say 6 or 7 guests to hear. He said, "She's had a little too much tonight. Newlywed nerves." Tommy straightened up. She hadn't had too much. I had been watching her all night, because that's my job. And she'd had 2 glasses of Prosecco over 5 hours. She was stone cold sober. I sat with that for a moment. The story of the drunk, erratic bride hadn't been invented after Lily escaped the hotel room. It had been constructed during the reception in front of witnesses with a glass of Cabernet and a performance that 6 or 7 people would later remember and repeat. Derek Ashford had not lost control that night. He had executed a plan so precisely timed that even the alibi for the alibi had been set in place before the harm had been done. "Would you be willing to tell that to a detective?" I asked. Tommy Reeves didn't blink. "I already wrote it down the night it happened," he said. He reached under the bar and produced a folded piece of notebook paper, which he slid across to me. Dates, times, what I saw, what I heard. I didn't know who to give it to. I figured somebody would come looking eventually. I took the paper and folded it into my inside jacket pocket. "One more question," I said. "The video the family gave to the police, the one showing her walking unsteadily in the lobby, what time was that?" Tommy frowned. "The lobby cameras would have that time stamped, but I can tell you that the Ashford family requested a copy of the lobby footage from hotel security the night of the wedding. Before midnight." He met my eyes. "Before she even went upstairs." The cold precision of it landed in my stomach like a stone dropping into still water. They had pulled the footage before the assault. They had selected the clip before the crime was complete. Every piece of the story they told the police had been assembled while Lily was still in that room, still refusing to sign, still fighting back. I was in my car when my phone rang. "Rosa Navarro." "Mr. Cole," she said. Her voice was different now, steadier, lower, like a woman who had made a decision and was standing on the other side of it. "I'll talk, but I need you to hear what I actually saw first, not what you're hoping I saw." "That's exactly what I want," I said. Rosa took a breath that I could hear through the phone, the kind of breath that precedes something a person has been holding inside for too long. "I was pushing my cart past the presidential suite," she said. "The door was not fully closed, maybe 2-3 inches open. I don't know why. Maybe someone came out in a hurry and didn't pull it all the way." Her voice dropped. "I heard a woman counting, out loud in a flat voice like she was keeping score. And when I slowed down, I know I should have kept walking, but I slowed down. The door opened from inside and the security guard came out." A pause. He had something in his right hand, coiled up, brown leather, wide like a belt but heavier. I pressed my fingers against my eyes. "Mrs. Navarro," I said, "would you be willing to repeat that to a detective?" Her answer came without hesitation, and it hit me somewhere behind my sternum. "Yes," Rosa Navarro said, "I would. Because I have a daughter too, Mr. Cole. And I would want someone to say what they saw." Sandra Okafor called me at 8:40 in the morning, while I was still sitting in my car outside the diner, where I had met Marcus Webb the day before, finishing a cup of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. "Raymond," she said, and there was something in her voice that made me set the cup down. "The hotel responded to our preservation notice last night. Their legal team sent a letter confirming that all surveillance footage is intact and preserved per our request." A beat. "Our forensic contact says the server logs tell a completely different story." I was already starting the car. Neil Carver operated out of a converted warehouse space in Culver City that he shared with 2 other independent forensic specialists, the kind of arrangement that looked chaotic from the outside and ran with the quiet precision of a surgical suite on the inside. He was a lean man in his early 40s with wire-rimmed glasses and the particular intensity of someone who found genuine joy in finding things that other people believed they had successfully hidden. He met us in the main room, Sandra and me on one side of a wide monitor, Neil on the other, and he pulled up his analysis without preamble the way people do when they've been awake most of the night working on something, and they want you to understand what it costs them. The video the Ashford family submitted to law enforcement, Neil said, pulling up two windows side by side on his screen, was not exported directly from the hotel's surveillance system. It was run through a third-party editing application first. See this. He tapped the right-hand window with one finger. The metadata timestamp in the corner of the frame, watch what happens at the 43-second mark. I watched. The timestamp jumped, smoothly, almost imperceptibly, but it jumped a gap of 32 minutes, compressed into less than a blink. Someone cut the footage, I said. It's someone cut the footage. Neil confirmed, then re-rendered it and exported it as a new file. If you're not looking for it, you'd never catch it. The timestamp is the tell. Original surveillance files from commercial hotel systems don't render with that kind of frame blending at cut points. The software doesn't work that way. This was assembled. He swiveled in his chair. The question was whether we could find out who assembled it and when. And, Sandra asked. Neil permitted himself a small, satisfied smile. That's where the server logs come in. He pulled up a third window, columns of text that meant very little to me at first glance and clearly meant everything to Neil. He leaned forward and ran his finger down a specific column. Hotel surveillance systems maintain a back-end administrative log that records every login, every access, every modification, and every deletion. This log is written to a separate partition of the server that standard administrative users cannot access or modify. You'd need direct hardware access to tamper with it, which would require physically going into the server room. He looked up at me over his glasses. Derek Ashford's administrative credentials logged into the hotel's surveillance management system at 3:06 in the morning. He accessed the presidential suite corridor camera archive, the elevator bank camera, and the service corridor camera near the east stairwell. Neil paused for effect. He deleted 3 files. The system logged every deletion with a timestamp and the credentials used. I felt the specific cold clarity that I used to feel in my working years, when a case that had seemed tangled suddenly resolved into a single clean line. He was covering the route she took to get out, I said. Service corridor to the east stairwell to the loading dock exit, Neil said. Yes, he deleted the footage that would have shown her escaping. He pulled off his glasses and polished them on his shirt. What he didn't know, what most people don't know, is that the deletion itself is logged. He thought he was erasing evidence. He was actually creating a very precise record of exactly which evidence he didn't want anyone to see, and exactly when he decided he needed it gone. Sandra was already on her phone, stepping toward the far side of the room. I heard her say D.A. Walsh's name, and then drop her voice. There's one more thing, Neil said, and his tone shifted, slightly less analytical, more deliberate. He pulled up an email chain that had been forwarded to him through channels I didn't ask about. 2 days before the wedding, Derek Ashford sent a request to the hotel's IT department. He cited privacy concerns for high-profile guests and asked that the cloud backup function for the presidential suite floor be temporarily suspended for the duration of the wedding weekend. He turned the monitor toward me so I could read it. The IT manager approved it the same day. Standard stuff. They get these requests from VIP guests occasionally. Neil looked at me steadily, which means that even if we had found a backup of the deleted files in the cloud system, there wouldn't be one. He made sure of that 48 hours before the wedding took place. I sat with that for a moment. Derek Ashford had disabled the backup system before the wedding. He had prepared edited footage to submit to police. He had logged into the server at 3 in the morning to erase the escape route. He had called a lawyer before he had called anyone else. Every single action after Lily walked out of that room had been the action of a man executing a contingency plan he had already prepared. This was not a crime of opportunity or impulse. This was architecture. Neil, I said, if law enforcement formally requests this analysis, I'll have a full written report prepared and signed within 24 hours of the request, he said. I've testified as an expert witness 14 times. I know what the documentation needs to look like. DA Patricia Walsh arrived at Neil's office 40 minutes later, which told me Sandra had conveyed the urgency with her customary efficiency. Walsh was a tall woman in her early 50s with silver hair cut short, and the measured, unhurried delivery of someone who had spent 20 years ensuring that what she said in courtrooms could not be easily dismantled. She reviewed Neil's findings without interrupting, asked 4 very precise questions, and then turned to me. I'm going to file for a search warrant for the hotel's physical server, she said. Based on the video metadata analysis, the administrative logs, and the corroborating witness statements you've already gathered, I expect to have it signed by end of business today." She tucked her portfolio under her arm. "Mr. Cole, I want you to know this case is being taken seriously. What your daughter described, combined with what your team has assembled in less than 4 days, is not a thin file." "It's not thin because she told the truth," I said. Walsh looked at me for a moment. "Yes," she said simply. "That's usually how it works." I was in the elevator on the way down to the parking structure when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. I didn't. "Mr. Cole?" A woman's voice, careful, a little breathless, like someone who had rehearsed the first sentence several times and was relieved to finally be saying it. "My name is Claire Hutchins. I think I know your son-in-law." A pause that carried real weight. "And I think what happened to your daughter happened to me first." The elevator doors opened onto the parking structure, and I stepped out into the smell of concrete and exhaust and stood very still. "Miss Hutchins," I said, "tell me when and where you want to meet." Claire Hutchins arrived at the coffee shop in Pasadena before I did, which told me something about how long she had been waiting to have this conversation. She was sitting at a corner table with both hands wrapped around a latte. She hadn't touched her back to the wall and her eyes on the door. She was in her early 30s with light brown hair pulled back and the kind of careful stillness that people develop when they have spent a long time being very alert to the moods of the room around them. When I walked in, she exhaled a long, slow release like someone who had been holding their breath for 3 years. "Mr. Cole," she said, standing and extending her hand. Her grip was firm, but her fingers were ice cold. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for calling," I said. I sat down across from her, and she started talking before the server had even reached our table. "I was engaged to Derek Ashford for 7 months," she said. 3 years ago. I thought he was the most attentive man I had ever met. He remembered everything what I ordered at restaurants, what movies made me cry, what I said in passing about my grandmother's apartment in Wicker Park. I'd moved to Los Angeles 2 years before I met Derek. Her jaw tightened. I didn't understand then that he was memorizing me, not because he loved me, because he was building a profile. "The apartment," I said. She nodded, and something hard moved across her face. "My grandmother left it to me when she passed. 1-bedroom Lincoln Park worth about $400,000 at the time. Derek started asking about it within the first 2 months. Casual questions was, it rented, was it mortgaged? What did the deed say about sole ownership?" She picked up her latte and put it down again without drinking. "About 4 months in, he proposed. It was perfect. The ring, the location, everything. I said yes." Her voice dropped. 3 weeks later, Carol and his mother invited me to lunch, just the 2 of us. Very warm, very gracious. She explained that Derek's business was going through a temporary cash flow problem, and that if I could put the apartment into a joint holding company as collateral for a short-term loan, it would all be sorted within 6 months. "And when you refused?" I asked. Claire's eyes went bright and sharp with tears she absolutely refused to let fall. "Derek told 3 of our mutual friends that I had cheated on him. He had screenshots. I still don't know where he got them or how he made them look convincing, but he had them. Within 2 weeks, the engagement was over, and I was the villain of the story." She pressed her lips together hard. "I lost the friends. I kept the apartment. I told myself I was lucky." She reached into her bag and produced a manila envelope which she set on the table between us and pushed toward me with 2 fingers. "Carolyn emailed me during the engagement," she said. "She sent a draft of the joint holding company agreement. I don't know why I kept it. I think part of me knew that someday I would need it." She tapped the envelope. "It's almost identical to whatever they put in front of your daughter. Same structure, same language, same transfer terms." I opened the envelope and looked at the documents inside. My hands were steady. The rest of me was not. I had spent 30 years reading financial fraud documents, contracts engineered to look reasonable on the surface while hiding the mechanism of theft in the subordinate clauses. This one was elegant in its simplicity. Once signed, the apartment would transfer into a jointly held entity that Carolyn controlled through a shell company. Claire would have retained her name on the paperwork while losing every practical right to the asset. It was the same trap wearing a different suit. "How long did it take you to understand what they had actually tried to do?" I asked. Claire's jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle move beneath her skin. "About 6 months after the breakup," she said. "When I had a real estate attorney look at the agreement out of curiosity. He went pale. She let out a breath that was not quite a laugh. He told me I had come within a signature of handing over everything my grandmother had left me to a company that didn't legally exist in the state of California. I set the documents back into the envelope and folded it carefully into my jacket pocket. "There's someone else," Claire said, and her voice dropped lower, carrying the weight of something she had been sitting with for a long time. "A woman named Diane Foster. She was married to Derek's cousin, same family, same playbook. She signed." Claire looked at me directly, her eyes fierce and unhappy and completely clear. "She lost her house. She's living in Silver Lake now. She's terrified. She hasn't told anyone officially because they threatened her, after the fact called her, made it clear what would happen if she made noise." Claire's voice hardened at the edges. "But I've spoken to her twice, and I think if someone came to her who wasn't pushing, who wasn't pressuring, I think she might finally be ready." I took out a pen and a small notepad from my jacket pocket. "Give me her address," I said. Claire hesitated for exactly 2 seconds. Then she picked up a pen from the table and wrote it herself, sliding the notepad back to me with the deliberate care of someone transferring something fragile. I looked at the address. Silver Lake. The same neighborhood where Lily's 4 rental units stood half a block from the reservoir, the building Derek Ashford had tried to take from my daughter on their wedding night. Something cold and very specific moved through me. "Miss Hutchins," I said as I stood to leave, "would you be willing to testify formally if it comes to that?" She didn't hesitate. She straightened her spine and looked at me with the clear, level gaze of a woman who had spent 3 years being angry about a story she hadn't been allowed to tell. Her chin lifted slightly, and for the first time since I had walked through the door, her hands stopped shaking. "I kept that envelope for a reason," she said. "I'd like to finally use it." I walked out into the Pasadena afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking down at the address in my hand. Diane Foster was living in Silver Lake, inside the very building they had tried to steal from my daughter. She had been there the entire time, sleeping under the same roof as the property Derek Ashford had spent months engineering a way to take without either of them knowing the other existed. I got in the car and pulled into traffic heading west. The woman they had victimized before reaching Lily was living inside the walls of the thing they had tried to steal next. Some coincidences don't feel like coincidences at all. They feel like something being put back into order. The drive from Pasadena to Silver Lake took 40 minutes in afternoon traffic, and I spent most of it thinking about the address written on the piece of paper on my passenger seat. Silver Lake was one of those Los Angeles neighborhoods that had reinvented itself twice in 20 years. Coffee shops and murals and farmers markets layered over an older, quieter residential identity that hadn't entirely disappeared. Lily's 4 rental units sat on a side street half a block from the reservoir. A clean 2-story building with terracotta planters by the entrance that Lily had put there herself the spring after she bought the property. I had helped her carry those planters up the front steps. I sat in my car across the street for a moment and looked at the building Derek Ashford had tried to steal on his wedding night. The building that was the reason my daughter had come home in a ruined dress, and I felt something move through me that was too complicated to name and too large to put away. So I got out of the car and walked across the street and pressed the buzzer for Unit 3. 30 seconds passed. Then a woman's voice came through the intercom, cautious and flat. "Who is it?" "My name is Raymond Cole," I said. "I'm the father of the woman who owns this building. I'm not here to cause you any trouble, Miss Foster. Claire Hutchins gave me your address." A long pause, long enough that I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then the door buzzed open. Diane Foster was standing in the doorway of Unit 3 when I reached the top of the stairs. She was around 30 with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of months of poor sleep, and she was gripping the doorframe with one hand the way people grip things when they need something solid to hold on to. She looked at me with the particular expression I had seen on Rosa Navarro's face, the expression of someone who has been afraid for so long that relief and terror have started to feel like the same thing. "You're her father," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. She stepped back from the door. "Come in." Her apartment was spare and carefully arranged a second-hand couch, a small dining table with 2 chairs, a bookshelf that was doing double duty as a room divider. The walls were bare except for one framed photograph above the kitchen counter, a house with a red door surrounded by autumn trees. I looked at it for just a moment before I understood what I was looking at. "That was your house," I said. Diane looked at the photograph. Her throat moved. I grew up in that house, she said. My grandmother left it to me. I had it for 2 years before. She stopped, pressed her palm flat against her sternum as if she could hold something in by force. Before I signed a piece of paper I should never have signed. She sat down at the table and I sat across from her, and she told me her story in the same sequential, controlled way that Lily had told hers in the hospital room, the way people tell stories they have rehearsed in their heads 1,000 times, because the telling is the only thing they can still control about what happened to them. Derek's cousin had been charming, she said. Attentive. The relationship had moved quickly, too quickly. She understood now, but she hadn't understood then. Within 3 months of the wedding, the family had begun asking about the house. Small questions at first, then larger ones. Then a meeting with a lawyer who explained a financial arrangement that would help the family through a temporary difficulty and would be reversed within a year. She had signed. The house was gone within 8 months. When she tried to report what had happened, she received a phone call from a man she had never met, who explained in very calm, very specific terms what the consequences of making noise would look like for her and her family. She had moved 4 times in 18 months. Silver Lake was the first place she had felt safe enough to unpack more than one box. I didn't know who owned this building, she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. I found it through a property management company. I never saw a name. She looked up at me, and her eyes were full and bright and desperate. I just needed somewhere to be, where I didn't feel like I was being watched. My throat ached. Ms. Foster, I said carefully. The woman who owns this building is my daughter. She is 28 years old. On her wedding night, the same family did to her what they did to you. And right now, we have testimony from 2 witnesses, digital forensic evidence, financial records establishing motive, and a prior victim who has already agreed to testify. I held her gaze. We need one more. Diane stared at the table between us. Her jaw worked. One tear broke loose and tracked down her left cheek, and she didn't wipe it away. She seemed to not even notice it. They told me no one would believe me, she said quietly. They said I signed voluntarily. They said I had no proof. Her voice hardened. They said women like me don't win cases like this. Women like you, I said, are the reason this case exists. She looked up at me. My daughter stood in a hospital room 4 days ago. I said, and she refused to be the last person this happened to. She needs you to stand with her, not in front of her, not instead of her, just with her. Diane Foster pressed both hands flat on the table, the same gesture Rosa Navarro had made, the same gesture of a person steadying themselves against something that is finally, after a very long time, moving in the right direction. Okay, she said. Her voice was rough and low and absolutely certain. Okay, I'll do it. I called Sandra from the car before I had even pulled away from the curb. We have 2 prior victims, I said. Forensic digital evidence, taxi footage, 2 eyewitnesses documented financial motive and matching contract language across 3 separate incidents. I pulled out into the Silver Lake afternoon. When is Walsh ready to move? She's been ready, Sandra said. You said you needed one more thing. I do, I said. I need them to say it themselves. The trap was the last piece, and I already knew exactly how to set it. Before I tell you what Sandra found in Margaret's own financial records, something so unexpected it stopped all 3 of us cold, drop a still here in the comments. I need to know you're with me because what I'm about to share is the twist none of us saw coming. Note this story contains some fictional and dramatized elements crafted to carry a meaningful message. If this isn't for you, feel free to find content that speaks to you better. Sandra called at 7:50 in the morning with a voice I had never heard from her before. Not urgent, not businesslike. Something quieter than both of those things and much more serious. Raymond, she said, I need you to come to Margaret's office. There's something she needs to hear from me in person, and I think she needs you in the room when she hears it. I was at Ellison Properties Group's Century City offices by 9. The building was the kind that made you feel the weight of serious money before you had even reached the elevator, cool marble lobby security desk, staffed by people who were polite in the specific way that means they are also very capable of being something else entirely. Margaret was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of her corner office when I walked in, looking out over the Century City skyline with a cup of coffee going cold on her desk. She turned when I entered, and I could see from the set of her jaw that Sandra had already told her something was coming. Sit down, both of you, Sandra said, closing the door behind me. She opened her portfolio on the conference table and turned it to face us. I found this late last night while I was running a cross-reference on Ashford Hospitality Group's debt structure. Margaret looked at the document. I watched her read it. I watched the moment it landed. It wasn't dramatic, no sharp intake of breath, no hand to the mouth. Margaret Ellison absorbed hard information the way she absorbed everything from the inside, with a stillness that cost her considerably more than it appeared to. But her left hand resting on the table curled slowly into a fist, and the color drained from her face in a way that no amount of composure could entirely conceal. "Explain it to me," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "All of it." Sandra nodded. 18 months ago, Ellison Properties acquired a distressed debt portfolio from a secondary market broker. The portfolio contained 47 separate commercial loan positions. One of them, she tapped the document, was a subordinated debt position in Ashford Hospitality Group. At the time of acquisition, the portfolio was reviewed at the aggregate level for risk assessment. Individual debtor names were not flagged for executive review because none of the positions exceeded the threshold that would require it. Margaret stared at the page. "So, I own part of their debt." "A minority position," Sandra said. "But yes. For how long?" 18 months. Margaret stood up from the table and walked back to the window, and I let her go. She stood with her back to us, her shoulders very straight, looking out at a city she had spent 40 years learning to move through, and I watched her process the specific cruelty of what she had just learned. She had spent 20 years sending money through trusts and funds and carefully constructed distances to keep Lily safe and provided for. She had built something powerful enough she believed to protect her daughter from anything. And for 18 months without knowing it, she had been lending that power to the people who would use a wedding night to take everything from her child. "Margaret," I said. She turned around. Her eyes were dry, but the skin around them was tight in a way that told me exactly what that was costing her. "I want to call in the debt," she said. "Today. I want to pull every dollar and watch them collapse." "You can't," Sandra said, and her voice was genuinely gentle. "Not yet. If you move against their finances now, the defense will argue that the entire investigation was financially motivated retaliation by a hostile creditor. It could compromise everything Raymond has built." Margaret looked at Sandra for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "So, I do nothing," she said. "You wait," I said, "which I know is harder." She turned back to the window. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to something I had to lean forward to hear. "I spent 20 years believing that staying away was protecting her," she said. "And then I spent 18 months accidentally funding the people who hurt her." She pressed 2 fingers against the glass. "Raymond, what kind of protection is that?" I didn't have an answer good enough for that question, so I told her the truth. "It's the kind that comes from people who love badly but love genuinely," I said. "And it's the kind we fix by doing this right." She didn't respond, but her hand uncurled against the glass palm, flat, like someone steadying themselves against something immovable. When I stood to leave, she said my name once more. "Does she ever ask about me?" Margaret said. "Even now?" I thought about Lily in the hospital, studying Margaret's face with that quiet, searching intensity. I thought about the hall light burning under the door. "She stopped asking," I said, "but she never stopped leaving the hall light on at night." Margaret pressed her lips together, nodded once very slightly. I closed the door softly behind me. Lily came home from the hospital on a Thursday, not to her own apartment. Her own apartment was in a building that Derek Ashford's family knew the address of, and until the legal situation was resolved, Sandra had been very clear that Lily should not be there alone. So she came to Pasadena instead, to the house she had grown up into, the bedroom that still had the same window she had climbed out of at 16 and climbed back into at 16 and a half after deciding the adventure wasn't worth the anxiety it caused me. I had made up the bed with clean sheets and put a glass of water on the nightstand and tried to remember what it felt like to have her in this house. And then she had walked through the front door and borrowed clothes that were slightly too large for her, and looked around the living room with the expression of someone who has been very far away and is not entirely sure they deserve to be back somewhere safe. She had hugged me in the entryway for a long time without saying anything. I held on and did not say anything either, because sometimes the thing a person needs most is to be held without being asked how they are. Margaret had been coming to the house every morning. She sat with Lily while I made coffee. asked careful questions about how Lily had slept, brought the specific chamomile tea that Lily preferred from a shop in Brentwood without being asked. She drove Lily to her follow-up medical appointments and waited in the lobby reading briefs on her phone. And when Lily came out, she never asked what the doctor had said. She just handed her the car door handle and drove. She was doing everything right. I watched her do it with the focused, deliberate care of a woman who understood she was being evaluated and accepted that she had earned exactly that. On the fourth day, I came into the kitchen at 7 in the morning to find Lily already awake sitting at the table with both hands wrapped around her mug, watching Margaret at the counter. Margaret was making toast and talking about a problem one of her properties was having. With a contractor, something mundane and practical, the kind of conversation that fills space without demanding anything. And Lily was watching her with an expression I recognized not from anything she had ever directed at me, but from the mirror from my own face in moments of very careful reckoning. She was counting things. I poured my coffee and sat down, and for a few minutes the three of us occupied the kitchen in the ordinary way of people who have gotten used to being in the same space. Then Lily set her mug down. "Margaret," she said. Margaret turned from the counter, and something in Lily's tone made her go very still. "How did you know I was allergic to ibuprofen?" Lily asked. Her voice was measured and deliberate, the voice she used when she had already done the thinking, and was now simply following the line of it to its conclusion. "I never told you. I never told anyone here except my dad, and that was years ago." She tilted her head slightly. "And the chamomile. I never mentioned it. You just brought it." She paused. "And last night when I couldn't sleep and I turned on the hall light at 2 in the morning, you were already awake. You were sitting in the living room in the dark. Not because you couldn't sleep, because you knew I would need the light on and you wanted to make sure the switch was close." The kitchen held its breath. Margaret set down the butter knife she was holding. She turned to face Lily fully, and for the first time since she had arrived at the hospital 11 days ago, she did not reach for composure. She let Lily see what was underneath it, the grief, the longing, and the years of both. "Lily," she started. "Don't," Lily said, and her voice cracked on the word, but her eyes stayed steady and direct and burning. "Don't explain it yet. Just tell me if I'm right." Her hands tightened around the mug until her fingers went white. "Tell me if I'm right about what I think I'm right about." Margaret looked at her daughter who had her own jaw and her own eyes, and 28 years of life that Margaret had watched from a distance through photographs and reports and birthday letters she had never been brave enough to send. "Yes," Margaret said. Her voice broke on the single syllable, like something that had been under pressure for a very long time. "You're right." Lily's breath left her in one long, shuddering exhale. Her eyes filled so fast she didn't have time to blink it back, and 2 tears ran straight down her face, and she didn't wipe them away, just sat there with her hands white-knuckled around the mug, and her chest heaving, and her whole face open in a way I had not seen since she was very small. "Dad," she said without looking at me. "How long?" I put my coffee cup down. My hands were not steady. "Your whole life," I said. The sound Lily made then was not crying exactly. It was something older and deeper than crying, the sound of a question that has been living inside a person for 28 years, finally receiving an answer. She pressed the back of her wrist hard against her mouth, and her shoulders shook, and Margaret took 1 step toward the table, and then stopped herself with visible effort, her own hands trembling, waiting to be invited rather than assuming the right. "I need to know everything," Lily said when she could speak again. Her voice was raw and unsteady, but her eyes when she looked up were absolutely clear. "But not tonight." She looked at me. "Dad, go get the box." I had been carrying that box for 20 years. I pushed back from the table and walked down the hall to my bedroom, and I opened the closet and I reached up to the top shelf where the box had lived, since before Lily could reach that high, and I took it down. It was lighter than it should have been for something that had weighed on me that long. I had been carrying it for 20 years. Tonight, I was finally going to put it down. I set the box on the kitchen table and sat down. Lily looked at it for a long moment without touching it, the way you look at something you have wanted for so long that the having of it feels dangerous. Then she reached out and lifted the lid. The first thing she pulled out was an envelope. Her name written on the front in handwriting she had never seen before, careful, slightly formal, the handwriting of someone who had thought about every letter before committing it to the page. She turned it over. The seal had never been broken. She looked up at Margaret. Every birthday, Margaret said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and it cost her visibly to keep it steady. I wrote one every year. I couldn't find a way to send them that didn't require explaining everything. So I kept them. She pressed her hand flat against her collarbone. I kept all of them. Lily opened the envelope slowly. She read the letter inside without speaking. I watched her face move through things I didn't have names for, her brow furrowing, then releasing, then furrowing again. When she finished, she folded it carefully back along its original creases and set it on the table in front of her, like it was something breakable. Then she reached into the box again. There were 27 more envelopes. There were copies of tuition invoices from her college with a trust account number in the memo line she had never thought to question. There were insurance documents, health and dental paid through a company she had always assumed was connected to her father's old employer. There were photographs, Lily at her high school graduation, Lily outside her first apartment, Lily at a farmer's market in Silver Lake, laughing at something off-camera photos taken from a distance. Photos she had never posed for photos that proved someone had been watching over her life from a place she couldn't see. She held up one of the photographs. Her hand was shaking badly enough that the image trembled. "This was 2 years ago," she said. "I remember that day. I remember what I bought at that market." Her voice climbed and she pulled it back down by force. "Who took this?" "Someone I hired," Margaret said, and did not flinch from the weight of how that sounded. "Not to surveil you, to make sure you were safe. To let me see," her voice broke and she stopped and started again. "To let me see you were okay when I couldn't be there myself." Lily set the photograph down. "Why couldn't you be there?" she asked, and her voice was not angry. It was something harder than anger, something that had been compressed by 28 years of not knowing into a question with genuine edges. "Why couldn't you just come?" Margaret sat down across from her. She did not look away. "At first I told myself it was for your safety," she said. "The threats were real, Lily. The people who wanted leverage over my business were real, and you were 3 years old, and I was terrified." She spread both hands on the table palms, up an offering with nothing in it. "But the threats faded, and I kept waiting, and the longer I waited, the more I believed I had forfeited the right to walk back in, that you had built a life that didn't have a door for me in it." Her eyes filled. "So I stood outside it, and I told myself that was love." Lily stared at her mother's hands on the table. "Dad," she said, without looking at me. "Yes. Why did you let me believe she just didn't want us?" I had been preparing for that question for 20 years. In 20 years, I had never once found an answer that was both true and adequate, so I gave her the only thing I had left. "Because I was afraid," I said. "If I told you the truth, if I told you I had kept this from you, I was afraid you would decide I wasn't worth keeping either." Lily looked at me then, really looked at me the way she had when she was small and trying to determine if I was telling her the whole truth about something. She reached across the table and picked up one of the unread birthday letters. "I'm not ready to say I forgive either of you," she said quietly. "I don't know when I will be." She looked at the envelope in her hands. "But I want to read these, all of them, tonight." She raised her eyes to Margaret. "And I want you to stay while I do." Margaret's breath left her in one long, silent rush. "I'll stay," she said. "As long as you need." The hall light was already on. For the first time in 28 years, all three of us were in the same room, with nothing hidden between us. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a beginning, and after 28 years, a beginning was everything. The offer arrived through a lawyer I had never heard of on letterhead, so expensive, it practically crinkled when Sandra set it on the conference table in front of me. $250,000, full payment of all medical expenses, no contest of the Silver Lake property. In exchange, Lily withdraws all complaints, surrenders all recordings and documentation, and signs a non-disclosure agreement of indefinite duration. I read it twice. Then I set it down and looked at Sandra. "They're scared," I said. "They should be," Sandra said. "The question is what we do about it." "We don't turn it down," I said. "Not yet." Sandra looked at me over the top of her reading glasses with the expression she used when she was deciding whether to argue. She decided against it. "Explain." I leaned forward and put both hands flat on the table. In 30 years of fraud investigation, the hardest cases to crack were never the ones where people lied to my face. The hard cases were the ones where people were careful, where they had lawyers in the room and scripts prepared and every word measured before it left their mouths. I looked at Sandra. But people stop being careful when they think they're winning, when they think the other side is desperate, when they think they're the smartest people in the room. Sandra's eyes sharpened. You want to let them believe we're considering it. I want to sit across from Carolyn Ashford and let her think she has the upper hand, I said. And I want a court order in place before I walk into that room. We drove to DA Walsh's office that afternoon. Walsh listened to the proposal without interrupting, her hands folded on the desk, her expression giving away nothing. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning something over in her mind. California is an all-party consent state for recorded communications, she said. You can't walk into that room with a recording device without their knowledge and have it be admissible. She held up one finger. However, under California Penal Code, Section 632, subsection B, law enforcement can obtain a court order authorizing consensual monitoring when there is probable cause to believe a crime has been committed and the monitoring is necessary to obtain evidence. She looked at me steadily. If you are acting in cooperation with this office formally on paper, I can file for that order today. The recordings would be fully admissible. How long for the order? I asked. Given what we already have, 24 hours, maybe less. I nodded. Then let's do it formally. Walsh pulled a cooperation agreement from her desk drawer, as if she had already prepared it, which told me she had already been thinking along the same lines. I signed it while Sandra read every line with the focused attention of a woman who trusted no document she hadn't personally reviewed. One condition, Walsh said as I capped the pen. You go in alone, no Sandra, no Margaret, no Frank. Just you. The story needs to be that your side is fracturing, that you need the money, that the women in your corner are losing faith. She met my eyes. Can you sell that? I spent 30 years reading people who were lying, I said. I know what it looks like from the other side. That evening I sat at the kitchen table after dinner, and Lily came in and found me there with the cooperation agreement on the table in front of me. She looked at it without picking it up. She knew what it was. I had told her the outline, not the details, because she deserved to know what was coming without being burdened by the mechanics of how. Dad, she said, what are you doing tomorrow? Something that should have been done a long time ago, I said. She pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, and she looked at me with an expression so much like her mother's that it stopped my breath for just a second. Can I come? She asked. No, I said, but I need you to trust me one more time. Lily pressed her lips together. Her eyes were steady and tired, and 28 years old, in a way they hadn't been a month ago. I've trusted you my whole life, Dad, she said. Even when I shouldn't have. I had no answer for that. I sat with it instead, the way you sit with something that is true and painful and deserved, and I let it settle into me. I know, I said finally. I know you have. She got up and squeezed my shoulder once as she passed, just her hand, just for a second, and then she went down the hall, and I heard her door close softly and the click of the hall light coming on. Before I tell you what happened inside that conference room, and what Derek said that he could never ever take back drop a 45 in the comments, so I know you're still with me. Because what comes next changes everything, and if this story has been speaking to you, you won't want to miss a single word. A quick note, some elements ahead have been shaped for storytelling depth. If that's not your preference, this is a good place to stop, no judgment at all. The conference room on the 14th floor of a downtown Los Angeles law office had the particular chill of a room kept cold on purpose, the kind of temperature that makes people want to finish their business quickly and leave. I arrived 5 minutes early and chose my seat deliberately. Back to the window facing the door, the same position I had used in 30 years of interviews across tables from people who thought they had the upper hand. I set my folder on the table, thin, noticeably thin, thinner than the reality of what we had assembled, and I folded my hands on top of it and waited. Carolyn Ashford came in first. She was dressed in the particular armor of a woman who had spent decades using appearance as a weapon. A cream blazer pearls hair, set with the rigidity of someone who controlled every variable they could reach. She moved through the doorway with the confidence of a person who had never once in her life walked into a room and doubted her position in it. Derek followed 2 steps behind her in a charcoal suit, and seeing him in person, really seeing him not through the filter of a hospital hallway at 3 a.m, or a grainy surveillance image hit me with something I hadn't anticipated. He was handsome. genuinely effortlessly handsome, with the kind of easy physical grace that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. I understood looking at him exactly how my daughter had believed in him. That understanding made something cold and very precise settle into my chest. Their lawyer, a silver-haired man named Garrett, who had the carefully neutral expression of someone paid very well to have no opinions, took the chair at the end of the table and set a stack of documents in front of him. "Mr. Cole," Carolyn said, settling into her chair with the deliberate ease of someone claiming territory. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. Thank you for the offer," I said. I let my voice carry the particular weight of a tired man, not defeated, but worn down, fraying at the edges. I had practiced this in the mirror that morning. "I want to resolve this. I think we all do." "We absolutely do," Carolyn said, and the warmth in her voice was so practiced it was almost convincing. Almost. "This has been a terrible misunderstanding. Our family cares deeply about Lily. We want what's best for her." "She needs stability," I said. I looked down at the folder. "The legal costs it's a lot, for someone in my position." I felt Derek relax across the table. It was subtle, a slight easing of the shoulders, a fractional shift in posture. But I had been reading bodies across tables for 30 years, and I felt it like a barometric pressure change. "Good. Let him relax." "We understand completely," Carolyn said, leaning forward slightly. "That's why we wanted to find a solution that works for everyone. A fresh start. No more conflict." "I just need to understand," I said, keeping my voice carefully uncertain, "what exactly happened that night, for my own peace of mind, before I can ask Lily to sign anything." I looked at Carolyn directly. "She came home to me with 45 injuries. I need to be able to explain that to her." Carolyn's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something: reassessment, recalibration. "Every family has difficulties," she said. "Sometimes communication breaks down, especially under the stress of a wedding. We only wanted to help Lily understand her responsibilities as part of our family." She spread her hands on the table in a gesture of reasonable openness. If she had approached the property matter differently from the beginning, none of this would have escalated the way it did. I let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. 45 times was just a communication breakdown, I asked. Derek's lawyer put a hand on the table, a warning gesture, but Derek had already opened his mouth. "Nobody planned for 45, he said, and his voice carried the flat, irritated certainty of a man who had stopped being careful. She kept resisting, so my mother had to continue. The room stopped. Garrett's hand came down on the table with a sharp crack. "We're done," he said, his voice stripped of all its careful neutrality. "This meeting is over, Derek." "You just told me a number," I said, and I let my voice go back to its natural register. Steady, quiet 30 years of doing this. A very specific number, one that has never appeared in any police report or any public statement. I looked at Derek. The only people who knew that number were in that hotel room. Derek's face went through several things in rapid succession: confusion, then the dawning comprehension of what he had just done, then something that looked almost like a physical pain as the full architecture of his mistake became clear to him. Carolyn was on her feet. "This meeting is over," she said, her voice rising. "Garrett, I want—" The conference room door opened. Detective Patricia Walsh stepped in, and behind her 2 detectives whose suits fit the way suits fit on people who spend their careers in them. Walsh looked at the room with the calm, measured gaze of someone arriving exactly on schedule. "Mrs. Ashford," she said pleasantly. "Mr. Ashford, I'm District Attorney Patricia Walsh." She set her portfolio on the table. "I have an arrest warrant for both of you, and I'd like to make this as straightforward as possible." I stood up and picked up my thin folder. Derek stared at me across the table. I watched it happen in real time, the mask, the whole careful construction of the charming wronged husband, sliding off his face like something that had never been properly attached. Underneath it was something I recognized from 30 years of sitting across tables from people who had finally run out of room. Just fear, plain and simple and total. "For 30 years, I said quietly, I found people who thought they had covered their tracks perfectly. They all had one thing in common. I picked up my jacket from the back of my chair. They always believed the person across the table was less intelligent than they were. I walked out of the conference room and did not look back. DA Walsh called at 7:48 in the morning. I was still in my car in the parking structure beneath the hotel where I had spent the night not sleeping, mostly just sitting with the particular exhaustion that comes after 30 years of work in one very long evening. "The bodyguard is talking," Walsh said. "Gary Simmons. He asked for a cooperation meeting at 6 this morning. He didn't even wait for his lawyer to finish his coffee." I closed my eyes for a moment. "What did he give us?" "Everything," Walsh said. "Come in." Walsh had authorized me to observe from the corner of the room, a courtesy extended to civilian cooperators in the investigation. Gary Simmons was a broad man in his mid-30s who looked considerably smaller than he probably had 24 hours ago when he had been employed and uncharged and certain that the Ashford family would protect him. He sat across from Walsh and two detectives in an interview room with his hands folded on the table and the expression of a man who had made a calculation and arrived at the only answer that kept him out of a cell for the next decade. He had agreed to cooperate in exchange for sentencing consideration. His lawyer, a compact woman named Torres, who moved through the room with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this negotiation many times, confirmed the terms before Gary said a word. Then Gary talked. Carolyn Ashford had contracted the arrangement 3 weeks before the wedding, Gary said. Cash delivered in 2 installments. His instructions had been specific. Remain in the suite, follow Carolyn's direction, and target areas of the body that would be concealed by formal clothing. Derek had been present and directing throughout. Derek's exact words. Gary said, his voice dropping with something that might have been shame, or might have been fear, or might have been both. "Don't touch the face. She has a photo shoot for the announcement in 2 days. We need her presentable." I felt a cold rage harden inside me, my fists clenching so tight my knuckles turned white, but I forced myself to stay completely silent. The lawyer, Gary continued, had been in the room until the documents were produced. He hadn't participated directly, but he hadn't left either. Then Gary gave us the location. A commercial dumpster behind the hotel's loading dock, second bay from the left. The leather-strapped Lily's phone and the unsigned transfer documents wrapped in a plastic bag inside a hotel laundry sack had been placed there the morning after the wedding by Gary himself on Derek's instruction. Frank Delgado met me at the loading dock an hour later. The dumpster had not yet been emptied. Walsh had a warrant. The recovery team went in wearing gloves, and Frank stood beside me on the dock, with his arms crossed, and watched them work with the focused patience of a man who had done this many times and never once stopped taking it seriously. They found the laundry sack in 4 minutes. The leather strap was inside, coiled and dark. The forensic team bagged it, tagged it, and Walsh's lead detective looked up at Frank and gave a single nod. Frank put his hand on my shoulder briefly. "Ray," he said. "It's over. You got them." I looked at the evidence bag and said nothing for a long moment, 45 times, and they had kept the instrument, because they had been so certain it was gone far enough away. My phone rang at 2 in the afternoon, an unknown number with a Los Angeles area code. Mr. Cole. The voice was older, slightly hoarse, with the careful diction of a man who had spent a long time choosing his words before he said them. "My name is Victor Ashford. I'd like to speak with you, if you're willing." I pulled over to the curb. Victor Ashford suggested a coffee shop in Glendale, far from the hotel, far from his family's lawyers, far from everything that bore his name. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in the corner in a plain gray jacket, no watch, no tie. He looked smaller in person than the photographs I had seen. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had recently set it down, not out of relief, but out of exhaustion. "I knew," he said, before I had finished sitting down. He didn't look away when he said it. "Not every detail, but enough. I knew what Carolyn was planning, and I told myself it wouldn't go that far. And then I told myself it was too late to stop it. And then I told myself it wasn't my business." His jaw tightened. Every one of those things was a lie, I told myself, because the truth required me to do something I didn't have the courage to do. "Why are you here now?" I asked. "Because Carolyn is in custody," he said, "and for the first time in 30 years, I can have a conversation without someone reporting it back to her." He looked at his coffee cup. "And because I have a daughter of my own. She's 23, lives in Portland, hasn't spoken to me in 4 years because she figured out a long time ago what kind of man I am." He looked up. "I'm not asking you to give me credit for this. I'm not asking for anything. There's a forensic specialist, independent. Her name is Dr. Joanne Mercer. She works out of Pasadena. She has never once adjusted her findings based on who was paying for the report." He slid a business card across the table. "She's the best in the state, and she can't be bought. I know because Carolyn tried 3 years ago on a different matter." I picked up the card. "Victor," I said, "is there anything else?" He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and stared into it. "Tell your daughter," he said quietly, "that I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't come close. But I need someone in that family to have said it, and I seem to be the only one who's going to." I drove back to Pasadena. In the late afternoon light, Dr. Mercer's card in my jacket pocket, and when I walked through the front door of my house, I found Lily sitting at the kitchen table with the box open in front of her, and a letter in her hands, one of the birthday letters, the pages soft from reading and rereading. She didn't look up right away. "She wrote to me every year," she said. I sat down beside her. "Every single year." Lily set the letter down carefully, the way she had set down the first one, like something she wasn't ready to put too far from her reach. She pressed both palms flat on the table and looked at the window and the evening light coming through it, and her voice when it came was rough and low and full of something she hadn't found a name for yet. "Why did she choose letters over me, Dad?" she asked. "Why wasn't I enough to make her come?" I had lived with that question in one form or another for 28 years. I had rehearsed answers and discarded them and rehearsed them again and always found them wanting. "I don't know," I said. It was the truest thing I had left. "But she's here now," and she stayed. Lily reached out and touched the edge of the nearest envelope, just the edge, just her fingertip, and did not say anything else for a long time. Outside, the evening settled over Pasadena, and somewhere down the hall, the light was already on. 6 months and 11 days after my daughter knocked on my door, in a ruined wedding dress, I sat in the front row of courtroom 7 at the Los Angeles County Superior Court and watched the people who had hurt her walk in to answer for it. The courtroom smelled like old wood and floor wax and the particular tension of a room full of people waiting for something that cannot be undone once it starts. I had been in courtrooms before, dozens of them, as a witness, as an investigator, as the man sitting in the hallway with a file folder while someone else's life was decided inside. But I had never sat in the front row on this side of the aisle, and the difference was not something I had been prepared for. Derek and Carolyn Ashford sat at the defense table in clothes chosen, I was certain by their lawyers, conservative subdued nothing that read as wealth or arrogance. Carolyn kept her hands folded in her lap, and her face composed in an expression of dignified injury. Derek stared straight ahead, with the careful blankness of a man who had been coached extensively on where not to look. Defense counsel had filed 2 motions to continue in the preceding months. Both had been denied. They had come to this courtroom without the runway they had wanted, and it showed in the set of their shoulders and the speed with which they reviewed their notes. D.A. Walsh rose for her opening statement, and the courtroom settled into the specific silence of a room giving its full attention to one person. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, "this was not a domestic dispute. This was not a misunderstanding between a husband and wife. This was a premeditated property crime planned weeks in advance and executed on a wedding night against a 28-year-old woman whose only offense was refusing to sign a document under duress." She paused and let that word sit in the air. "The evidence will show you that every element of this crime was planned. The documents were prepared 3 weeks before the ceremony. The alibi was constructed during the reception. The surveillance footage was deleted at 3 in the morning by a man who believed he had thought of everything." Another pause. He hadn't. Marcus Webb took the stand first. He had dressed carefully for this, a dark blue jacket, no tie, the quiet dignity of a man who understood the weight of what he was doing. Under Walsh's guidance, he described the night in the same direct, unhurried way he had described it to me in the Silver Lake Diner. When the dash cam footage played on the courtroom screen, the sound of Lily's voice filled the room. "They want to take my property. Please just drive." Several jurors leaned forward. One woman in the second row pressed her hand briefly to her mouth. Rosa Navarro followed. She wore her good blouse and sat very straight in the witness chair, and she told the jury what she had heard and seen in the hallway of the presidential suite floor in the same careful sequential language she had used when she called me back that afternoon in my car. When she described the counting, a woman's voice counting out loud in a flat tone like she was keeping score. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. Defense counsel cross-examined her, hard questioning her vantage point, her line of sight, her timing. Rosa answered every question in the same measured tone. She did not waver. She did not embellish. She simply told the truth over and over until the attorney sat down. Tommy Reeves confirmed that Derek Ashford had been stone-cold sober all evening and had deliberately poured a glass of wine down the back of Lily's dress before escorting her upstairs. He still had the handwritten notes he had made that night, which Walsh entered into evidence with the efficient precision of someone laying out a hand of cards she had been holding for a very long time. Neil Carver walked the jury through the server logs and the metadata analysis with the practiced clarity of a man who had done it 14 times before. He did not use jargon where plain language would serve. When he explained that Derek's administrative credentials had accessed and deleted 3 specific camera files, at 3:06 in the morning, 2 jurors wrote something down simultaneously. Then, Dr. Joanne Mercer took the stand. She was a woman in her late 50s with silver hair, and the unhurried confidence of someone whose conclusions had never once been successfully challenged in a courtroom. She presented the forensic medical analysis of Lily's injuries with the same calm authority she would have used to describe weather patterns, systematic evidence-based, utterly without drama. At 45 separate contusions, she said, distributed across the upper back shoulders, lateral arms, hips, and upper thighs. The force vectors, angles of impact, and distribution pattern are physically inconsistent with self-infliction. She turned slightly to address the jury directly. To produce these injuries on oneself, a person would require a range of motion and leverage that human anatomy does not permit. These marks were made by an external force applied repeatedly to a person who was restrained. The defense attorney rose for cross-examination and asked 3 questions. Dr. Mercer answered each one with the same composed precision, and on the 3rd answer, the attorney thanked her and sat back down with the body language of someone deciding not to throw good money after bad. Claire Hutchins testified about the engagement, the apartment in Lincoln Park, and the email from Carolyn Ashford with its attached draft agreement. She was composed and direct, and she looked at the jury when she answered not at the defense table. Diane Foster testified about the house with the red door, and what it had cost her, and why she had been silent for so long. Her voice broke once on the word house, and she stopped and pressed her lips together and started again, and when she finished, there was a stillness in the room that felt like the collective breath of 12 people absorbing something they would not soon forget. Then Walsh stood. "Your Honor," she said, "the people would like to play a recorded conversation obtained pursuant to a court-authorized monitoring order." She pressed play. Derek Ashford's voice filled the courtroom. Nobody planned for 45. She kept resisting, so my mother had to continue. I watched the jury. I had spent 30 years reading faces across tables, and I read these faces now with everything I had. The woman in the 2nd row, the one who had covered her mouth during the dash cam footage, looked at Derek with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of someone who has just finished making up their mind. Derek stared at the table in front of him. Carolyn turned to her attorney and said something in a low, rapid voice. Her attorney put a hand on her arm and said something back, and whatever it was, it did not appear to help. Walsh walked back to her table, set down her remote, and looked at her notes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked up. "The people call Lily Cole. I heard her before I saw her, the sound of her footsteps from the back of the courtroom, measured and deliberate, the particular rhythm of someone who has decided exactly how they are going to walk into a room and is not going to be rushed." The gallery shifted as she passed heads turning, and I kept my eyes on the front of the room. I had not been there the night she walked into a trap. I was not going to look away now. Lily Cole sat down in the witness chair like she had been born to occupy it. She did not fidget. She did not look at the defense table. She set both hands flat on the railing in front of her. I could see the faint silver lines of the scars on her right wrist from where I sat, catching the courtroom light, and she looked at D.A. Walsh with the clear, steady attention of a woman who had decided exactly how this was going to go. The gallery was completely still. Walsh began with the chronology, the reception, the elevator, the door closing, in the presidential suite. Lily answered in the same measured sequential way. She had answered Detective Mitchell in the hospital room 6 months ago, except that now her voice carried something it hadn't carried then. Not anger, something older and more durable than anger. Certainty. She described Derek taking her phone. She described Carolyn's voice, the flat, businesslike tone, the document spread across the table, the demand for a signature. She described the moment she understood that the man she had married was not going to help her. "He told me to stop fighting," she said. He said the sooner I signed, the sooner it would be over. She paused for one beat. I didn't sign. Walsh walked her through the escape, the hairpin, the service door, the stairwell. Then she stopped and looked at her notes, and the slight change in her posture told me she was shifting into the part she had saved. Ms. Cole, Walsh said, you mentioned the engagement ring your husband used when he proposed to you. I'd like to direct your attention to Exhibit 31. The ring appeared on the screen, a photograph close up the inner band clearly visible. Can you tell the jury what that engraving says? Lily looked at the screen. It says C and D forever. C for Claire, D for Derek. Her voice didn't waver. He proposed to me with a ring he had taken back from his previous fiancée after he destroyed her life. He told me he had it custom made. He told me the initials stood for Cole and Derek. She looked at the jury directly. The entire relationship was a performance. Every word of it, every gesture. A murmur moved through the gallery. The judge did not have to use the gavel. It subsided on its own, as if the room itself was absorbing what it had just heard. Then Walsh asked about the instructions Derek had given regarding the location of the injuries. Lily's jaw tightened. He told her to avoid my face, she said. He said, and I am quoting him, exactly we need her presentable. She has a photo shoot for the announcement in 2 days. She looked at the jury, and her voice dropped to something very quiet and very precise. He was managing a timeline. I was an item on a schedule. Walsh nodded once. Thank you, Ms. Cole. No further questions. Defense counsel rose. He was a careful man, methodical, and he had clearly spent considerable time preparing this cross-examination. He began with her state of mind. At the reception, had she been drinking? Had she been under stress? Had she and Derek argued earlier in the evening? Lily answered each question with the same composure she had carried through the direct examination, and I watched the attorney recalibrate after each answer, searching for a crack that wasn't there. Then he leaned forward slightly and said, Ms. Cole, isn't it true that you have a history of anxiety and emotional instability that your own father has expressed concern about on multiple occasions? Lily looked at him for a moment. Then she reached forward and picked up the evidence bag that Walsh had left at the edge of the witness stand, the one containing the leather strap coiled and dark inside its clear plastic. She held it up so the jury could see it clearly, and her arm was completely steady. Was I emotionally unstable, she said, when he held my wrists against the headboard, or was I just inconvenient? The attorney opened his mouth, closed it. Because this, she set the evidence bag down with a precise, controlled movement, is what inconvenient looks like when a Ashford decides to make a point. 3 jurors in the front row were leaning forward. The woman from the second row had her pen pressed against her notepad so hard the tip had gone through the paper. It was at that moment that Derek Ashford made his mistake. He looked at Lily, and he smiled. Not a full smile, not something the gallery could have easily named, but the particular curve of his mouth that I recognized from the way Lily had described it in the hospital room. The private practiced expression he had used 100 times to make her doubt her own perceptions. The smile that said, I still have power over how you see yourself. Lily looked at him, and she did not look away, and she did not flinch, and she did not give him anything he was reaching for. She turned her head slowly and deliberately back to the jury, and when she spoke, her voice was the steadiest it had been all day. I am not a piece of real estate, she said. I am not an asset to be acquired or a problem to be managed or a signature on a transfer document. She looked at each juror in turn, moving slowly down the row. I am the woman who is standing in this room and telling you the truth, and I am sending them to prison. Carolyn Ashford came out of her chair. Get that girl out of here, she shouted, and her voice was so raw and so uncontrolled that it sounded like something tearing. She is a liar. She has always been a liar. You have no idea what she cost us. The gavel came down hard enough that I felt it in my chest from the front row. Mrs. Ashford? The judge's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. You will be removed from this courtroom. 2 officers moved to the defense table. Carolyn was still talking, still insisting, still performing a version of wounded dignity that had completely collapsed as they escorted her through the side door. And the last thing I heard from her was not a defense or a denial, but a demand sharp and indignant about whether anyone understood who she was. The door closed behind her. In the silence that followed, defense counsel rose from his chair. He straightened his jacket, gathered his papers, with the careful movements of a man who was making the only rational decision left available to him. Your Honor, he said. The defense withdraws its witness list. The judge looked at him over her glasses for a moment. The jury will disregard, she began. We're not requesting a mistrial. Your Honor, the attorney said, we're simply withdrawing. The judge studied him for another moment. Then she nodded. We'll recess until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning for closing arguments. Lily stepped down from the witness stand. She walked back down the center aisle, and as she passed the row where I was sitting, she didn't stop. She didn't look at me. But her hand came out to her side as she passed, and her fingers found my hand for exactly 1 second. A brief, sure pressure, like someone confirming a signal, and then she was past me and walking toward the back of the courtroom. I looked straight ahead. In 30 years of investigations, I had sat in courtrooms and conference rooms and parking lots and hospital hallways, and I had never once in any of them allowed myself to cry. I came very close that afternoon, closer than I had ever come to anything. The jury was out for 3 hours and 14 minutes. I know the exact number because I counted every one of them in the hallway outside courtroom 7, sitting on a wooden bench with a cup of coffee. I didn't drink watching the minute hand of the clock above the elevator make its slow, indifferent progress around the face. Margaret sat beside me. She had been there since 9 in the morning, not in the courtroom, because Lily had asked her to wait outside, and Margaret had said, of course, without hesitation, without hurt, without anything, except the quiet acceptance of a woman who understood she was still earning her place in the architecture of her daughter's life. We didn't talk much during those 3 hours. We didn't need to. There are certain kinds of waiting that require nothing from the people doing it, except the willingness to keep sitting still, and Margaret and I had both spent enough years sitting with difficult things to know how to do it. At 2:17 in the afternoon, the clerk appeared at the courtroom door. Jury's back, she said. Margaret reached over and gripped my hand. Her fingers were ice cold, and her grip was fierce, and I held on, and we walked back into the courtroom together. Lily was already in her seat directly behind Day Walsh's table, in the area reserved for the victim. She turned when we came in and found us with her eyes, and the look she gave me was the same look she had given me from the hospital gurney 6 months ago. Not asking for rescue, just making sure I was there. I was there. The jury filed in. I watched their faces the way I had watched them throughout the trial, reading the body language, the direction of their eyes, the small unconscious signals that people give off when they have arrived at a conclusion. The foreperson, a man in his 50s with the careful posture of someone who took the weight of the moment, seriously held the verdict form in both hands and did not look at the defense table. That told me everything I needed to know, but I kept breathing anyway. On the charge of felony assault with a deadly weapon, the foreperson said, his voice steady and clear, "We, the jury, find the defendant Derek Ashford guilty. Guilty. On the charge of felony assault with a deadly weapon, we find the defendant Carolyn Ashford guilty. Guilty." The word fell 6 more times, once for each count, landing in the courtroom like stones dropped into still water. Extortion, criminal conspiracy, destruction of evidence, witness, intimidation. Each one clean and final and irrevocable. Carolyn had been permitted to return for the verdict reading standard procedure in California, criminal proceedings, regardless of prior removal. Her composure, which had reassembled itself somewhat since her removal of the previous day, collapsed again, not into the entitled fury of the courtroom, but into something smaller and more frightened. She grabbed her attorney's arm with both hands and said something rapid and urgent, and he put his hand over hers and spoke quietly, and she pressed her lips together so hard they went white. Derek did not reach for his attorney. Derek turned and looked at his mother. It was the look I had half expected and half dreaded cold, assessing, already calculating. Not grief, not remorse, not the shared recognition of 2 people who had done something terrible together and were now facing the consequence. It was the look of a man deciding who was going to absorb the blame for this and arriving at his answer very quickly. He was going to survive this the way he survived everything, by making it someone else's weight to carry. Carolyn saw the look. I watched her see it. And I watched something in her face, something she had been protecting for 30 years, some version of the story she told herself about her son, go very quiet and very still. Judge Patricia Coleman, a woman whose reputation for zero tolerance on domestic violence cases was well established in Los Angeles County, allowed the gallery a moment before she called for order. Then she looked at the defendants with the focused, dispassionate attention of someone who had seen the full evidence of what they had done and had formed her conclusions without sentimentality. "Mr. Ashford," she said, The court finds that the premeditation, the methodical nature of the planning, and the complete absence of remorse demonstrated throughout these proceedings warrant the maximum consideration within the sentencing guidelines. She paused. You are sentenced to 14 years in the California State Correctional System. She turned. Mrs. Ashford, the court finds that your role as the organizer of this criminal enterprise, combined with your conduct during these proceedings, warrants a sentence of 10 years. The sound of handcuffs was very loud in a room that had gone very quiet. I looked at Lily. She was sitting perfectly straight in her chair, with her hands folded on the table in front of her, and she was not watching Derek be handcuffed, and she was not watching Carolyn be led away, and she was not performing anything for anyone in the gallery. She was just sitting with the fact of it, the plain, solid, finally arrived fact of it, and letting it settle into her. The way good things settle when you have waited a long time for them. Walsh leaned down and said something close to Lily's ear. Lily nodded once and almost smiled. Outside the courthouse, the Los Angeles afternoon was bright and warm and entirely ordinary, the way the world always manages to be on the days when extraordinary things happen inside buildings. There were reporters, not many, but enough, and Walsh handled them with the practiced brevity of someone who had learned that the less you say at a courthouse door, the better. Margaret steered Lily past the cameras with one hand very lightly at the small of her back, and Lily let her. We got into Margaret's car. The three of us, father, mother, daughter, the family, we had never quite managed to be until a wedding night, and a ruined dress and 6 months of fighting forced us into the same room and kept us there. Margaret drove. I sat in the passenger seat. Lily was in the back. For a long time, nobody said anything, and I did not reach for conversation because the quiet felt earned and I didn't want to disturb it. We were on the 10 heading east toward Pasadena when Lily spoke. It was one word, soft, careful. The way you say a word you have never let yourself say before, because you didn't know if you were allowed, and you're testing it now, just testing the shape of it in your mouth to see if it fits. Mom, the car did not swerve. Margaret's hands stayed exactly where they were, on the wheel 10 and 2, and she looked straight ahead at the freeway, and the only thing that changed was that her jaw tightened, and then released and tightened again, and her right hand moved from the wheel and came back to it, and she pressed her lips together very hard. I looked out the passenger window at the Los Angeles basin sliding past in the afternoon light, and I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth, and I breathed. In the back seat, I heard Lily make a small sound. Not a sob, not quite something quieter than that, something that had been waiting 28 years for a single syllable to unlock it. She said it the way you test a word you have never been allowed to use. And the whole car shifted like something that had been held at an angle for 20 years had finally been set down flat. None of us said anything else for the rest of the drive home. We didn't need to. 1 year to the day after my daughter knocked on my front door in a ruined wedding dress, I drove to Silver Lake in the early morning with the windows down and the October air coming in, cool and clean off the reservoir. Los Angeles in October has a particular quality of light, lower and softer than the summer glare, the kind that makes everything look like it has been thought about carefully before being placed. The side street where Lily's building stood was quiet at this hour. The terracotta planters by the entrance full of late-season herbs that she had put in herself sometime in August when she decided the building needed something living at its front door. I parked and sat in the car for a moment. A year ago, I had parked on this same street and looked at this same building and felt something too large and too complicated to name. I had stood on that sidewalk knowing that the people who wanted to take it from my daughter had come very close to succeeding, and the weight of that had been almost physical. This morning, the weight was gone. I got out of the car and walked to the entrance, and Lily met me at the door before I could knock. She was in paint-stained jeans and a worn flannel shirt that I recognized as one of mine from 20 years ago, that she had stolen sometime in her teens and never returned, and she had a travel mug of coffee extended toward me before I had even said good morning. "Margaret's already upstairs," she said. "She brought pastries from that place in Brentwood. She brings pastries every time she comes now. I think it's her love language." I took the coffee. "Is that a complaint?" Lily considered this with genuine seriousness. "No," she said. "It is absolutely not a complaint." She was smiling, not the careful, measured expression I had watched her construct and maintain throughout the trial, the one that cost her something every time she used it. This was the stomach laugh, the unself-conscious one, the same one I had watched across a reception hall 1 year ago tonight and told myself meant everything was fine, Everything was fine now. The apartment that had been Unit 3, the one where Diane Foster had lived in, frightened quiet for 18 months, had been renovated over the summer into something warm and functional and deliberately unhurried. There were 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with good light, and a small sitting room that Lily had furnished with second-hand pieces chosen for comfort rather than appearance. On the coffee table, there was a bowl of fruit and a notebook and a pen, and on the wall above the couch, there was a framed print of the Silver Lake Reservoir at sunrise. There was no television. Lily had decided after considerable thought that the first thing a person needed when they arrived somewhere safe was quiet. Margaret was standing in the kitchen when we came in, arranging pastries on a plate with the focused attention she brought to everything, and I stood in the doorway for a moment and watched her. This woman who had spent 20 years building an empire and 25 minutes once a week for 20 years writing letters she never sent. And I thought about the strange mercy of second chances, that they come at all, that they arrive when they do, in the form they take through doors we never thought to look for. I thought about God's timing, how it had placed Marcus Webb's taxi on that street at exactly 1:17 in the morning, how it had kept Rosa Navarro on that hallway floor long enough to hear what she heard, how it had put Diane Foster in this building, in this apartment, months before any of us knew she would be needed. You could call these things coincidence. I had spent 30 years investigating the way the world works, and I had stopped believing in coincidences a long time ago. God does not always work loudly. Sometimes he works through a woman who decides to call back, and a man who keeps a business card for 22 years, and a daughter who refuses to sign her name to a lie, no matter what it costs her. Dad. Lily was beside me, looking at the same thing I was looking at. You have the face you make when you're thinking too hard. I'm allowed, I said. I'm 65. She bumped her shoulder against mine. Come on. Margaret's been warming up a speech about the structural integrity of croissants for the last 20 minutes, and I think she needs an audience. We went inside. The 3 of us sat around the small kitchen table with coffee and pastries, and Margaret did, in fact, have strong opinions about croissants, about the number of layers, about the temperature at which they should be served, about a specific bakery in Lyon she had visited in 1987 that had apparently solved the croissant problem definitively, and then tragically closed, and Lily argued with her about all of it, with the specific cheerful energy of someone who has recently discovered the pleasure of disagreeing with their mother about things that don't matter. I sat with my coffee and listened, and did not say very much because I was busy doing something I had not done nearly enough of in the past 65 years. I was paying attention. After a while, we went downstairs together to stand in front of the building's entrance. Lily had installed a small sign beside the door. Not a plaque, nothing formal, just a piece of reclaimed wood with hand-lettered text in dark paint that she had done herself on a Thursday afternoon in September. A safe door always opens from the inside. Margaret read it. She pressed her lips together and reached out and touched the edge of the wood with 2 fingers, very gently. The way you touch something you want to make sure is real. It's good, she said. Her voice was not entirely steady, and she did not try to make it so. I know, Lily said. She looked at the sign for a moment longer, then looked at us, her father on one side, her mother on the other, the family that had taken 28 years and one catastrophic night to occupy the same sidewalk at the same time. I want to say something before we open the door and it becomes about everyone else. Go ahead, I said. Lily looked at the sign. I used to think I had been cheated, she said. No mother, one parent, a life built on something I didn't know wasn't entirely what it seemed. She paused. And then I thought I had been broken that night in the hotel, and the weeks after, and all the times I woke up at 3 in the morning and couldn't remember what safe felt like. She turned to look at us, and her eyes were bright and clear and completely without apology. But I wasn't cheated, and I wasn't broken. I was just being made into the person who could do this. She gestured at the building, at the sign, at the street. So I'm grateful. Even for the hard parts. Even for the parts that shouldn't have happened. She looked at Margaret. Even for the letters I had to wait 28 years to read. Margaret made a sound that was not quite a word, and reached out and pulled Lily into her arms. And Lily went, and I stood on the sidewalk in the October light and looked at the 2 of them and felt something I didn't have a name for, that was bigger than relief and quieter than joy and more durable than either. I thought about the night I had opened my front door and thought I was watching my family be destroyed. I had been wrong. Not about the darkness of that night that had been real, and the damage had been real, and the long climb back had been real, but about what it meant. The door I had opened that night had not been the end of anything. It had been, as the sign said, as Lily had come to understand, long before I did the beginning. A safe door always opens from the inside. Lily pulled back from Margaret and wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, and then laughed at herself for crying, which made Margaret laugh, which made me laugh, and for a moment the three of us stood on a Silver Lake sidewalk in the October morning, making noise together in the uncomplicated way of people who have earned the right to it. Then Lily took out her keys. She looked at the door. She looked at us. She took a breath. And she opened it. I spent 65 years believing silence was protection. This family story proved me wrong. I kept secrets to keep my daughter safe. Instead, I left her alone in the darkness that secrets build. If this family betrayal has taught me anything, evil doesn't announce itself. It arrives with flowers, a ring, and a rehearsed smile. And the people who love you most can cause the deepest damage simply by staying quiet. Don't be like me. Ask the hard questions. Watch what people do, not what they say. When someone you love is hurting, show up. Not with money, not with letters you never send, with your presence. My personal belief, after living this family story, a family isn't made by blood or law. It's made by the choice to stand together and refuse to walk away. I believe God places the right people at the right doors, at exactly the right moment. We just have to be brave enough to open them. This family betrayal reminded me silence is never neutral. It always chooses a side. If this family story moved, you drop a comment, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very end. Upcoming stories contain dramatized fictional elements crafted for meaningful impact. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. Find what speaks to your heart.